There are misinformation experts out there bravely protecting us from unapproved truths. All right, sarcasm off. We're going to be talking today about con artists as well as cons. But the most important thing is we're going to learn why if you're outsourcing your fact checking and your information vetting to so-called experts, you're probably getting a flavor of politics that you hadn't counted on. I'll explain more in just a few moments.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there and welcome to Know Where to Hide. Twice a week, I have the opportunity to sit down and go through some of the more egregious examples of media bias and spin that tip their hand that really they're not there to protect us from untruth or to even more importantly, keep us informed where we can make good decisions because we have enough facts at hand, but rather to keep us on the narrative that those in power would prefer that we stay on. So to this end, we've all encountered fact checkers. If you've been on social media, you know there's almost no controversial subject you can post without drawing the attention of fact checkers who will tell you, well, that's mostly true or it's mostly false or some other kind of spin. So Harvard did a survey of 150 different misinformation experts. Now, this is kind of like safe sex. You know, back in the day when people confined sex to marriage, or at least that was the cultural expectation, you didn't have to talk about safe sex. In the same sense, you didn't have to talk about fact-checking and misinformation and fake news when news media and journalists mostly reported facts and let you make up your mind. I want you to see what the results were as far as where the political leanings were of these 150 fact checkers and misinformation guards that were interviewed or surveyed by Harvard. This is from an article published by the Mercator Institute. Kurt Malberg is the author. But look at this, the political leaning of misinformation experts. Okay, that red line you see right in the center, that would be centrist thinking. I want you to look and see how many of those 150 misinformation experts fell to the right of that centrist thinking versus how many can be found on the left. You get the picture? If your facts are being checked by these misinformation experts, there's a pretty good chance that whatever information you are getting is leaning hard to port. So think about that. And then in light of that too, this tweet talked about Brett Weinstein testifying before, I believe it was a congressional committee, talking about every public truth-seeking institution being under simultaneous assault. Now, Dr. Weinstein's message is a wake-up call. He says, in every single institution dedicated to public truth-seeking, and yes, there are institutions that are out there trying to get the facts and get them out to the public, but there's a state of collapse underway. Weinstein says it highlights a disturbing pattern of systemic attack on the very fabric of social enlightenment. And he highlights the systematic attempt against building down the base of public trust and public integrity. Every body of experts fails utterly, meaning if those experts don't buckle, if they don't toe the line, they are either marginalized or they're forced out. Now, what does that mean? Well, we need to get some kind of government action. We need to, make laws about. No, we don't. If you really want to see journalism come back to actually being journalism, the first thing that we're going to have to do is show them something that they're kind of learning at some cost today, and that is you guys aren't even necessary. People can check their own facts. People can do their own research. And I know, but what are they, experts? Well, that depends. You can become an expert. If it matters enough to you, you can absolutely become an expert. I have a really dear friend in southern Utah who had never kept bees before, but someone was wanting to give up their bees and said, would you want to be an apiary? And she said, okay, well, I'll look into it, and decided, yeah, we'll do it. And at that point, she started studying and learning, and she was involved with 4-H, which may have helped her somewhat. But the point is she became very involved to the point that she is a bona fide expert at beekeeping. And when a swarm is found, instead of, just bringing out a can of Raid and killing it all, people are told, call her, because she knows how to come and take care of it, capture the queen, take the swarm away and hive them. So yeah, if you can do it with bees, I'm sure you can do it with other, subjects as well. But if you're listening to the experts who are trying to push you in a particular direction, have you noticed it's going to the left? Well, now it looks like Harvard's survey of misinformation experts has inadvertently shown maybe it's on purpose. We'll talk more about that coming up. So I wanted to share this with you. This is a tweet series from Anthony Esolen. He's a great writer, but he introduces us to a new word that you probably haven't heard about, but it applies very directly to the culture wars and several aspects of the culture wars that are going on around us. The word is physiophobia, hatred of what is, celebration of the unnatural. So I have to hit pause for just a second and ask you this. Do you know people who have trouble with reality? As in they don't want to acknowledge reality? You know, biologically born males wanting to play on women's sports teams and so forth. It's pretty common, and it's becoming more common. So here are a few examples of what that looks like and what it means. As far as physiophobia, Anthony Esolen says there can be no end to it once you commit yourself to physiophobia, because nature is what it is, regardless of our desires or fantasies. Thus, the physiophobic belief that an unborn child in the womb is not human has caused people to revert to pre-modern embryology and fetology in their belief that quickening, the word meant coming to life, and was based on the belief that before such time the child was an inanimate accretion of matter, kind of like coral, that divided the non-human from the human. Now, he goes on to talk about a few other examples. So the physiophobic hatred of boys, for example, because they grow up to be men, and men, generally speaking, are a lot stronger than women. That's made them the targets of ideological contempt at school. They are made to know constantly that their sex is responsible for everything bad in the world, and that there's nothing for which they are needed precisely as male. But then the physiophobia goes further, with boys being celebrated if they parade themselves as effeminate, and this with the encouragement of teachers and sometimes single mothers with bad consciences and the mass entertainment industry. Oh, he doesn't pull punches. He says, also, I've seen a lot of commercials begging us to save sports for girls and women. Now, he says, I've never been interested in those, but as a matter of common decency and fairness and sanity, I understand that if you want girls to get a fair chance at playing soccer or field hockey or whatnot, you have to keep the boys out. Girls' sports are predicated upon that exclusion. Now, he says, I've long suspected many feminists never gave a damn about sports one way or the other, but did support women's sports because they hated men's sports or they envied them. In other words, for them, not for all, but for quite a few, it was a matter of physiophobia. But now that work has been done, they're willing to look the other way while boys pretending to be girls invade the girls' sports, take away medals, knock their teeth out, and so on. This is not a contradiction of the previous motive. What is constant is the hatred of nature. And he has a couple other examples. For instance, it's natural to protect the innocence of children and their long period of sexual latency, a period which we have barely begun to investigate and think about. For it's helping boys and girls to understand themselves as boys and as girls, to form friendships before the turbulent rapids of puberty, and to learn 1,000 things without the distraction of eros. The urge to talk to children about sex, thoroughly perverse if it's other people's children, and not without suspicion if it's your own, is an urge to invade that protected space, perhaps because the adults in question had their own space violated long before, but underneath it is a hatred of children as children, a desire to make them sexually precocious. That, too, is physiophobic. Next, he talks about when you see someone use the term cis-het, right? Cisgender, heterosexual. Almost always it's used with a probrium, right? It's an epithet and a puerile desire to appear smarter than ordinary people. You've got somebody who wants to cast something that's perfectly normal, as boys are made for girls and girls are made for boys, as something weird, nasty, stupid, hateful, and so forth. It's physiophobia, hatred of the ordinary, the natural, the real. He says if you hear someone call the fetus a parasite, or if you see someone reduce the act of sexual intercourse, that is the intercourse of the sexes, such as man and woman, each for the other, to just a mere choice of organs and orifices, or if you find people eager to override parental authority and the rights of the family to protect children in school who are acting out what they cannot know, rather as madness, with the parents cast as the enemy, you are in the midst of physiophobia. He says the sheer gruesomeness and ghastliness of spaying girls and gelding boys or flooding their systems with massive doses of synthetic hormones seems not to move the physiophobe, nor should we expect otherwise. A perfectly normal and healthy kid turned into a physical wreck, a eunuch for life. If that does not move you to righteous indignation against the perpetrators, he says, I wonder whether you retain any sense of the beauty of ordinary reality. And only a few civilizational minutes ago, everyone across the political spectrum in all the continents of the world, among people of every race and creed, would have agreed. It is kind of stunning when you think about how far we have come just in the last 10 years. If you could time travel someone from 10 years ago to today, how shocked would they be at what is not only commonly accepted, but now is actually celebrated? In fact, in some cases, it's mandatorily celebrated. Interesting stuff. I appreciate Anthony Esselin paying attention. Now let's move on to a couple of Idaho-related things. This was a rare thing, but a week ago I had the opportunity to interview Representative Ilana Rubel. She is the House Minority Leader in the Idaho legislature. And we always have cordial conversations. We don't agree on very many things, but Ilana is she's a very down-to-earth person as far as very easy to talk to. She's not antagonistic. And so even though we are polar opposites as far as our ideological beliefs, it's always an interesting conversation. And I had to mark that date on my calendar because I found that Ilana and I were in violent agreement on something very important. And that is, neither one of us wants to see the people of Idaho or the people of the United States conned by a con, as in a constitutional convention. This is a piece that she co-wrote with a Republican representative, and I want to just give you a couple of excerpts of what Representatives Ilana Rubel and Judy Boyle had to say about the con, which is being promoted right now to the Idaho legislature. Now, they start by noting they're both of different parties and they often disagree, but they are allied in their fierce devotion to America's Constitution. Now, I have to say this. I would love to see that fierce devotion translate into actually adherence to it, where government powers are limited. But they both agree it's under serious threat from well-meaning people who seek a constitutional convention. And from here's a little civics lesson for you. There are two ways to alter the U.S. Constitution. The first and only way our Constitution has ever been amended in its 237-year history is for Congress to propose an amendment and then pass it by 2/3 vote. Then 3/4 of the states have to ratify. Everyone sees the amendment language. Everyone knows exactly what they're voting on. Now, the second way would be, of course, through a Article 5 convention. Basically, you do what the founders did. They went to fix the Articles of Confederation, ended up tearing it up and starting over. Now, the people who are promoting a con right now tend to come from the conservative side, and yet their efforts, while maybe well-intended, are a little bit scary in that they seem to think we could get a similar result if we were to basically improve on the original Constitution, the organic Constitution. So Ilana Rubel and Judy Boyle say, look, history rebuts the idea that in a con, delegates' power could be restricted to a single item. That's the danger of an Article 5 convention. The original 1787 Constitutional Convention was called solely to ratify the Articles of Confederation. It was actually to amend them, but the delegates ignored that limitation and drafted our current Constitution, including new ratification rules. And they point out top legal scholars across the ideological spectrum, from Justice Scalia to Harvard's Professor Tribe, have agreed that subject limitations could not be enforced once a constitutional convention begins. I think the official term is a runaway convention, which is what happened in Philadelphia in 1787. So this other way to alter the Constitution, that's the way that the founding fathers used it. Alterations in this case could not be reliably limited to a particular known proposal. Delegates could concoct changes on the fly to anything or everything. There are no set rules determining how the delegates holding such staggering power would be chosen. We would be counting on a dysfunctional Congress to set those rules. Now, I want to add, would you trust Mitt Romney to amend the Constitution or rewrite the Constitution? Now, some people would, and that's their right. For many of us, and I mean on all sides of the political spectrum, though, we'd say no. Politicians are opportunists at heart. And some of them are not only opportunists, but they're power seekers on top of it. Who would choose the delegates who would take part in such a convention today? I have a pretty good hunch it would be the same kind of people that are currently running roughshod over the Constitution right now and are not threatened in the least by the limitations that are very clearly spelled out in it. So why would we take that chance? And I think this is one of those warnings that needs to be heeded. There are, I believe, 34 states needed to call into session a constitutional convention. 27 states have already said, yes, we want to be a part of it. Once that number hits 34, Congress has to convene it. So what this means is Idaho is one of only 7 states standing in the way of a potential gutting of our founding document, and proponents are working overtime to hit that tipping point. And some powerful Idaho legislators, that would be establishment legislators, have this as a top priority for this session. Does that seem like a good idea to you? These 2 representatives say the public must loudly tell their legislators not to risk a runaway convention that could gut our precious Constitution. We agree that federal debt should be reined in and the government could be improved across the board. But there are many ways to do so without taking unconscionable risks with the document that is the foundation of America's freedom and prosperity. This is not a partisan issue. It's a matter that ought to concern all Americans. Now, I want to step back for one second. Why would the Constitution be the document that is the foundation of America's freedom and prosperity? The answer may not be what you're thinking, but it's because it restricts and limits and defines the upper limits of government power. It called into existence the federal government, described exactly what each branch was allowed to do, and strictly limited that power. I know, the politicians today don't seem to behave that. They don't treat the Constitution as any kind of a threat. That's on us, the American people, for not insisting that they show a little more fidelity to something that they swore an oath to uphold. Something to think about as you hear calls for this con. Oh, it's a con, all right. We can stop with one. We don't need 2 cons. And speaking of rights, if you're going to read anything this week to broaden your understanding, I have to recommend Brian Allman's article about from where do rights come. This was his Sunday devotional on the Gem State Chronicle, and it touches on something that you're going to be hearing more and more about as this election year progresses, and I presume as other political policy debates move forward. That is the injection of the terms Christian or Christian nationalist. That is rapidly being set up as the new pseudonym, or the new it's another way of trying to say these people are racist and religious crazies, so that's why we can't have them participating in the political process. But that's a pretty low bar. If you believe your rights come from God, well, then you're just some kind of Christian nationalist, according to some. Let's take a look at what Brian says. I just have a couple of quick excerpts to share with you here. On MSNBC this week, Hyde discussed the threat, yes, her words, of Christian nationalists. The one thing that unites all of them, because there's many different groups orbiting Trump, the thing that unites them as Christian nationalists, not Christians, by the way, because Christian nationalism is very different, she says, is that they believe our rights as Americans, as all human beings, don't come from any earthly authority. They don't come from Congress. They don't come from the Supreme Court. They come from God. Now, I realize, there are a lot of people who really thrive on the whole binary thing. Look, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists, right? But this is one of those cases where either your rights come from government or they don't. If there is a higher moral authority than government, then government has to stop when it hits its limits. So you can see where people who really want to expand government into every possible aspect of life, they're not going to like the idea that, what do you mean your rights come from God? They don't want that competing moral authority. This is, by the way, why in the most totalitarian regimes, churches are always the first to go. You cannot risk the population having competing moral authority when the state is telling them, no, you have to do what I say. So let's move on with another comment here from Brian Allman. If rights do not come from God, then they must come from governments or from societal consensus. But here's the danger. In both of those cases, they can just as easily be taken away by the same people who deigned to grant them. Even the smartest atheists understand that removing America's Christian foundation leads not to a Star Trek-style utopia, but rather the sort of horrific slaughter that defined much of the 20th century, as in unlimited government power. Under Stalin, under Pol Pot, under Hitler, under Mao, you name it. Brian Allman says, only Christian nationalists would believe something as crazy as rights coming from God. You're not one of those people. That's the way it's being weaponized against us. He says, if we're to fight this pernicious ideology, we cannot give an inch with regards to the truth of our natural God-given rights. We must not accept their rewriting of history to erase America's Christian foundation. There can be, by the way, I have to say here, that Christian foundation was not the foundation of a theocracy. The founders were much wiser than that, but they absolutely understood the importance of a widespread morality found among the population. If you're going to teach morality to widespread, large groups of people, religion really is the best way to do it. Now, the left has its pet religions, climate worship being one of them, the woke religion being another, And they won't call them religions, but they behave much the same. They proselytize, they have dogma, they have original sins and so forth. The bottom line is there can be no neutral ground on this issue. Either our rights come from God and the purpose of government is to protect them, or rights are granted by consensus and government can erase them on a whim. That's a lot to think about, but it really is the nature of the problem. And if you don't believe in God, that's fine. Say that your rights are natural. But the main thing you have to understand, if you want to live as a free man or woman, is that those rights precede government. And they are yours so long as you are willing to claim them, use them, and defend them. So if you're sitting back waiting for someone in a black robe to tell you, well, this is permissible and this isn't, I'm sorry, but you're doing it wrong. You should probably read a little bit more of Brian's writings, maybe delve into some of the founding documents. You know, the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers can tell you a lot about what the founding generation was thinking. Look at the ratification debates that took place within the states. Many of those states would not ratify the Constitution unless there was a Bill of Rights that explicitly limited the government's power. And I mean really explicitly. First Amendment, Second Amendment, anyone? Hello. Because they did not want government slipping off its chain and running amok. So beware of the con jobs and the con artists. The fact checkers are not there to protect you from, misinformation. They're there to make sure that you are only consuming the kind of misinformation that benefits the people who have hired them in the first place. They're political masters or they're economic masters. And as far as the con, if if you don't feel like we have the same caliber of people as of the founding generation, then it's probably not a good idea to throw your weight behind rewriting the Constitution. We would not get a similar result, and I don't think any of us, on the left or on the right, would likely be happy with what would ensue. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how